Hi students, it's Miss Vernon, and I'm back with the second day of our lesson P5, Solving Equations. Today we're going to focus on two objectives. The first is learning how to complete the square, and the second is applying the completing the square process and then solving a quadratic equation. Let's go ahead and jump in to our lesson. So we are going to begin by going over how do you complete the square. I've broken it down into a step-by-step process, and I'm going to show you the process as we go through the problem. So to begin, we're going to apply the solving by completing the square process with this problem here. The first step is to pull it apart and make some space. So what I mean by that is we're going to take our equation and we're going to pull it apart so that it becomes or gives us the opportunity to have a perfect square. What this looks like is I add in some number, but I don't know what that number is yet, so we're just going to leave a blank space. Now, in order to keep the problem balanced, if I add in some number, I also have to make room to subtract it off. Now, because I could remove these parentheses, we haven't actually changed the original problem. I'm adding on some amount and I'm taking off that same amount, which means we're still keeping the problem balanced. Step 2 is to simply check. If there's no coefficient in front of x squared, that means the a value is 1. In this case, our a value is 1. So we checked that and we're good to go. If the a value is not 1, we have to factor it out. We'll see an example of that later in the lesson. Step 3 of completing the square is to take half of your b value and square it. And then you add it on and subtract it off of the same side. So in this case, I'm looking and my b value, or my b value from up here, it doesn't matter, is negative 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take negative 12 divided by 2, and I'm going to square this answer. What I get is 36. This is the number that's going to go on to each of the lines. So I have x squared minus 12x plus 36. And then I have plus 5 minus 36. Now, if I simplified this all back down, I'd end up with what I started with. So we're still good. We haven't changed the process. Next is really just more of a reminder. So if we had to factor something out, the number that we subtracted out here is going to be impacted by that. So I'm going to just put that in as a step, but we won't need to do it for right now because we didn't have an a value other than 1. All right, we're almost in the home stretch. We're going to factor the perfect trinomial next. Now, you might say, what's she talking about? The highlighted part here is what we're calling the perfect trinomial. Because of how we chose each of these values, it's going to make it factor really nice. How nice? Well, if I created a sneaky square over here, I know that I would have x squared and I'd have a positive 36. And to make it add to negative 12, I'd have negative 6 and negative 6. So when I go to factor this, I get x minus 6 times x minus 6. This is what we're defining as a perfect square. X minus 6 squared is what we call the perfect square. So now we have factored this. In general, you won't have to go on the side and do this factoring. What's going to happen is this highlighted part will always factor to x and then just take half of that b part, and that's what goes here. So if it would have been plus 12, I would have put plus 6, and then it's always a squared value. In step 6, we're going to finish our simplifying, which just means combining the 5 and negative 36, and we have now completed the square. Completing the square is also sometimes referred to as putting it in vertex form. This is the vertex form of our equation. So if you ever are asked to find the vertex form, that's another way of saying complete the square. We didn't have to solve this problem because we have an x and a y. We were just working on the completing the square part. We will have to solve in the future, so stay tuned for how to solve. Let's go through a couple more problems and make sure we have the process down. I don't have the process next to us for this problem, so you're just going to have to follow along, and hopefully you wrote it down in your notes if you decide to reference it. Notice before we start this problem that there is a coefficient in front of the x squared, so we'll have an extra step. To begin, we still start with step 1, which is pulling apart the equation, making room for a value that we will eventually pick and add on, and we have to subtract it off to keep it balanced. Next, we check, is there a coefficient in front of the x squared? In this case, there is. So I'm going to factor the 2 out of the x squared term and the x term, because those are the only terms impacted by that. So I have x squared plus 4x plus some number minus 5 minus some number. Next, we're going to determine what number goes on to that blank. To determine this, we're going to take 4 is our newly found b term, divided by 2, and we're going to square it. When I do this, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to put a 4 on the line. Now, this is that step 4 that I said be careful. Because we factored a 2 out first, this 4 was actually an 8. That's why we multiply the number we subtracted off by 2. Next, we're going to factor our perfect trinomial. Remember, our perfect trinomial is the one in parentheses, and it always factors really nice. In this case, this is going to factor to x plus 2 squared. And then I have minus 5 minus 8. Last, I'm going to just go ahead and simplify. So I get x plus 2 squared minus 13. Again, this one just asked us to complete the square. It did not ask us to solve yet. So we're good to go. We've now completed the square and we finished this problem. Notice the biggest difference between our initial walkthrough and example A is that there was a coefficient in front of the x squared. This added 2 steps to our process. It required us to factor the 2 out of the parenthesis part, and it also required us to multiply our subtracted off term by the coefficient we factored out. Everything else in the process was exactly the same. And again, notice we ended up with a quadratic equation in vertex form. Let's move on to another example. This time, you'll see the directions tell us to complete the square, and then we're going to solve the problem. We're going to do the process the same exact way as we did the previous one. So step 1 says to pull apart the problem and make some room. So we have x squared minus 4x plus some number. Notice we always add on this number. Then we have minus 12 minus some number equals 8. You don't have to worry about setting this equal to 0. This is the one way of solving that doesn't make you set it equal to 0 first. Next, we are going to check. The coefficient in front of x squared is 1, so we're good to go there. So we're ready to go ahead and figure out our b value, or our b value, and put in our magic question or our numbers on the blank line. So to find this, we take negative 4 divided by 2 and we square it. When we do this, we get negative 2 squared, which is a positive 4. So I'm going to add on 4, and I'm going to subtract off 4. Now that we have the problem filled in, we're ready to factor that perfectly set up trinomial. That's the highlighted part. When I go to factor that beautifully set up trinomial, I get x minus 2 squared. And in combining the rest of it, I get minus 16 equals 8. Now that I've completed the square, I'm ready to do my balancing and solve for x. Notice that I can solve for x because there is only one x. It is going to require doing a square root eventually, but I can still do this process. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. X minus 2 squared equals 24. Next, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root undoes the squaring and leaves me with x minus 2 equaling plus or minus the square root of 24. Last, I'm going to add 2 over. I like to put my added value in front of the square root, and I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 24. Now I am going to encourage you to pause for a second. Remember, we learned how to simplify radicals in an earlier unit. So we should always check, can I simplify this square root? And in this case, the square root of 24 is 4 times 6. The square root of 4 is 2, so this simplifies to 2 times the square root of 6. Instead of leaving my answer in this unsimplified radical format, I'm going to go ahead and state my final answer as 2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6. Now remember, we did find 2 answers because we have the positive and negative listed here. All right, friends, I've got one more example for us to go through today, and then we will set you off to do some practice. In example C, again, you see we are going to complete the square and then we're going to solve it. Let's go ahead and get started by pulling apart our problem. 2x squared plus 16x plus some number. Again, we don't know what that is yet. We're going to wait until the process tells us to do it. Plus 18 minus that number equals 0. Again, notice if I add it on, I have to subtract off that same value. Next, I notice I have a coefficient in front of x squared, which means I need to take that out of the terms in the parentheses. So I have 2 times x squared plus 8x plus some number. And then I just bring down the remaining part of the problem. Now I'm ready to figure out what number goes onto those lines. To do this, I am going to use my factored out term. So my b value is 8 divided by 2 squared. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So 16 is the number that goes on my first line. But remember that factored out 2 is going to impact that 16. So really, I need to subtract off 2 times 16. Now I'm ready to do the factoring of that beautifully set up trinomial. So there's my trinomial. Take a second, pause the video, figure out what that's going to factor to. All right, we're back. Let's see if you factored it correctly. Did you get x plus 4 squared? I did. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue to simplify. I want to finish getting everything combined, so I'm ready to go for the remaining parts of the process. When I combine the 18 and negative 32, I get 2 times x plus 4 squared minus 14 equals 0. Excellent job. We're ready to do our solving. If you'd like, pause the video and see if you can solve it on your own. If you needed some support, I'm here. So I went ahead and added 14. Now be careful. You got to get rid of that 2 in front of the parentheses before you take the square root. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. When I do this, I get 7. Now I'm able to do the square root. Square rooting both sides gives me x plus 4 equals plus or minus 7. Last but not least, subtract the 4, and we get our final answer of x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 7. There you have it. You managed to solve a little bit more complicated quadratic with completing the square. Great job on today's lesson. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that the quadratic formula was developed or derived by taking and completing the square on your ax squared plus bx plus c equation? That's where it comes from and why we use a similar process when solving. Now that you have this down, head on over and do some more practice with your class. Bye now.